before introducing Michael, I have a few announcements. My name is Dawson White. I'm a postdoc here in the Herbaria. First announcement is that our next HUH seminar is going to be on December 12th, where we're welcoming Mason Heberling from the Carnegie Museum of Natural History. Same time, Friday on the 12th. Also, the seminars next semester are going to be moved to Wednesday at noon. So perhaps, try and keep your schedules clear for that time. And I also want to mention that our new working group on Indigenous community partnerships is actively shaping its scope and programming. It's chaired by Atso Seguin, who's in Janine's lab. And we invite everyone to join in our upcoming dialogues and contribute to these conversations. Please talk to me afterwards if you want to get on that email list, and otherwise look out for departmental emails. So one more kudos, thank you to Peter Wiggin, our greenhouse manager, for bringing a live example of the focal taxon here today to the seminar.
Yeah, thank you, Pete.
Has this happened? Have we gotten some plants in here before for a talk that anyone can remember?
Not really.
Woo.
Well, we're still within the safe place to do so.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So,
To do it more.
Absolutely.
yeah, I talked to Jack. Of course, this is permitted.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. All right, for the main event, on behalf of the HUH Seminar Committee, it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Michael Coe from Tarleton State University to the Harvard University Herbaria. Thank you for being here. I'm especially excited about the topics Dr. Coe will discuss today because they bridge topics of our scientific exploration of biodiversity with the species that's most profoundly shaping it right now, at least, and that's our own. And Dr. Coe's work examines how humans interact with their environment and how societies throughout history have identified and used organisms, most notably plants, and applied them for scientific purposes. And herbarium specimens here, sorry, not scientific purposes, specific purposes, right? Our discovery of useful plants in the wild. And herbarium specimens here continue to serve as the primary source of evidence and information for the Western scientific community regarding these many uses for many of the plants around the globe. So while there are many topics that Dr. Coe is going to talk about here, I also want to highlight a broader point, which is that our botanical collections have always depended on relationships from people from all walks of life as we are conducting field work and depositing them here. And as we reflect through the lens of what is ethical science today, our community is increasingly recognizing how rarely contributors outside of academia have been fully acknowledged in this work. And so we are certainly working and trying to identify paths to better improve these practices, an ongoing process. So I'm excited today for us to think critically about how we can continue to build on collaborative relationships, another topic being touched on here, and working towards shared benefits and goals defined jointly or even primarily by these other partners. And so community engagement and sustainable development are not niche topics when it comes to addressing the biodiversity crisis. And these partnerships are not only advancing the science that we're doing, but they're also opening new windows into the uses of our collections through time. So with that, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you,
Michael, and take it away.
Yeah, I just want to first thank, colleagues here at the Herbaria, Harvard University, for this incredible opportunity to connect with you all and to share the story of my research. I'm hopeful that this is the beginning of many fruitful collaborations where we can help to address some of the concerns globally for conservation biology and the management of natural resources in which all humanity relies on, and also to help advance the theoretical development of ethnobiology as a discipline. So to give a little background on myself, I earned my bachelor's in science at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And at the same institution, I earned my master's in science and PhD in ecology, evolution, and conservation biology. From there, I completed a postdoc with the French National Institute for Research and Development and the Mediterranean Institute for Biodiversity and Ecology in Marseille, France. And I'm now an assistant professor in the Department of Biological Sciences at Tarleton State University in Texas. And much of my work has focused on investigating the relationships between humans and the environment and the conservation implications of plant use and management of natural resources by human societies around the world. And for over a decade, I've been conducting theory-inspired, hypothesis-driven research in ethnobiology, as well as harvest impact assessments on culturally important plant species using applied ecological methods. And because I've been classically trained as a population ecologist with interest in conservation biology and ethnobiology, research in my lab now focuses on understanding the dynamics of how ecosystems respond to human-caused disturbances and how these anthropogenic disturbances affect the population dynamics of useful species. And we're also seeking to understand the relationships between how plants respond to anthropogenic disturbances and local ecological knowledge, and how these relationships actually drive adaptive ecosystem management practices by local people. And one of the goals of research in my lab is to use interdisciplinary approaches through the lenses of applied ecology and ethnobiology to help inform and develop sustainable use strategies for natural resources that are essential to the livelihoods, the subsistence, the survival, the cultural identity, and human welfare of human societies around the world. Now, to put my work into the context and framework of contemporary ethnobiology and hypothesis-driven research, I'll briefly discuss several evolutionary developments of the field. And for those that are unfamiliar, ethnobiology is the study of the direct interactions between humans and the environment. And as a starting point of the evolution of the field, I'll draw your attention to Harvard's well-known professor and ethnobiologist Richard Evans Schultes in his tenure in the Northwest Amazon, where he lived among indigenous Amazonian communities. He tasted the bitter leaves of plants that they use for healing, and he participated in daily subsistence activities that allowed him to gain a unique and in-depth perspective of the way in which they relate to nature and utilize nature in such ways that were far different from his own. And Schultes was certainly responsible for accelerating the development of utilitarian ethnobotany, which is a subdiscipline that focused on primarily identifying plant species and their uses with practical implications for drug discovery. And Schultes articulated this in more than 400 publications that he produced throughout his lifetime that provides us a glimpse into the remnants of an ancestral past, a past of plant use among indigenous peoples of the Northwest Amazon that lay in the wake of the Spanish conquest. Now, since Schultes' time, ethnobiology as a discipline has continued to evolve to include numerous subdisciplines, each with their own methodological advancements to investigate the interactions between people, organisms, and culture. And as a result, most ethnobiologists today have a wide range of expertise. They're either trained biologists that are comfortable in conducting interviews and asking questions about plants, animals, or environmental use, or they tend to be social scientists that are interested in learning about and identifying or cataloging plant or animal species. In fact, many ethnobiologists have expertise in a range of backgrounds stemming from botany, pharmacology, sociology, archaeology, linguistics, and other related fields. And given such a multifaceted set of backgrounds, consistent with the diverse methodological culture of the discipline, numerous ethnobiologists today have been exposed to a wide range of analytical methods of inquiry that combine the skills, the intuitions, the research, and the biases from people in all these areas. And historically, the discipline has been focused on two main areas of inquiry, one being cognitive ethnobiology, where researchers tend to focus on how humans view and classify the environment, and also how they name useful species, which tend to follow general rules across language systems and related cultures. And the other main area of inquiry has been focused on utilitarian ethnobiology, which Schultes and other researchers have brought into focus that primarily identified useful species. And ultimately, this is the bulk of research that has been conducted to date in the discipline. Now, as the discipline has continued to evolve, it's undergone numerous growing pains where over the last several decades, there have been calls, indicating that there's a lack of unifying theory in the field. And at the same time, there's been internal discussions about the overemphasis on data compilation in general. And this was started back in 1978 by Ford. And this issue was further brought to the forefront by Oliver Phillips and Al Gentry in a paper that they authored in the early 1990s, where they discussed the lack of consistent methodological rigor and the frequent unwillingness to test hypotheses. And at the time of this publication, the notion that a direct connection to theory-inspired research and hypothesis testing would actually move the discipline forward and facilitate collaborations across related disciplines was actually widely accepted and received. However, several decades later, Gary Martin wrote several books contributing to the discipline and highlighted that the same issues persist, suggesting that research should be theoretically motivated, and ultimately the ability of the discipline to directly contribute to scientific discovery and human welfare should only be accomplished by the formation of general principle, which can be guided by hypothesis-driven research. And echoing the sentiment, Brad Bennett, professor at Florida International University, highlighted that most of the students that he encountered tended to focus on a particular study system or a particular set of plants or a particular culture, rather than having theoretical motivations for research. And so he added to the emphasis that there needed to be an increase in this area and move in that direction. And while these persistent calls for theory and hypothesis-driven research have been promising, in some cases, the need for theory has been met with confusion, in that it's often been misinterpreted, where there's been an increased emphasis on quantification in search of methodological rigor, but in lieu of theoretical development. And this has led to an emergence of a quantitative era of ethnobiology and the development of numerous quantitative indices to help improve the rigor of the discipline. Now, in this era of quantification, work done by several colleagues at the same institution, University of Hawaii at Manoa, by Tim Gallagher and Bruce Hoffman, they highlighted a pivotal synthesis paper that illustrated all the numerous indices created in ethnobiological research to enhance the discipline. Now, what's wonderful about this publication is that they call for a careful consideration on how they're applied in order to directly address the research aims of a given study. And as part of my graduate work at the same institution, alongside my mentor, Dr. Orogawe, I showed that most of these indices are actually strongly correlated, which means that they tend to estimate the same factors surrounding medicinal plant use and selection, even though these indices have been presented as unique quantifiers of ethnobiological data. Therefore, we call for an honest reevaluation on how these indices are applied in ethnobiology and suggest, instead of an overemphasis on their use, that we can actually test hypotheses more directly using state-of-the-art statistical methods. And thanks to persistent calls by others, noticeably Ulysses Albuquerque in his lab in Brazil, the discussion on the need for theory had remained in internal discussions in the development of the discipline. And his group highlighted several foundational publications and books highlighting that theory actually exists in the discipline and that many theoretical developments have been borrowed from other disciplines like chemical ecology, social psychology, and anthropology. And unfortunately, most studies to date have omitted their theoretical motivations for research. So as a result, in 2017, colleagues along with myself and mentor, we put together a pivotal synthesis paper highlighting 17 major theories in the discipline and their hypotheses as a starting point for developing research questions that'll allow people to be able to advance the research moving forward with a real theoretical motivation. And for each theory we highlight, we identify its testable predictions and hypotheses and how they've actually been tested to date. Now, 5 years later, we follow up with this paper highlighting advanced statistical modeling that'll allow people to directly test the major theories and hypotheses that we highlighted in our earlier 2017 paper. And the idea behind this is that by providing a clear synthesis on the theories and hypotheses in the discipline, along with a direct path forward on how people can test them directly using advanced statistical methods, that this would further encourage more hypothesis-driven research in the field and finally answer a call that was put forth nearly 5 decades earlier. Now, the culmination of our 2 papers have led to an internal discussion and debate in the discipline, particularly in the Journal of Ethnobiology and Ethnomedicine, regarding the need for theory and hypothesis-driven research versus the more classical approach solely focused on data compilation in general. And 3 years after this publication, I started my faculty appointment as an assistant professor in the Department of Biological Sciences at Tarleton State University. And I've recently established my lab, further focusing on hypothesis-driven research in the field, medicinal plant harvest assessments, and ultimately the development of interdisciplinary methods for the co-creation of knowledge, combining contemporary science with local ecological knowledge in order to co-produce actionable solutions to help guide and inform sustainable management of natural resources. Now, within this framework, research in my lab aims to uncover both local and global trends surrounding medicinal plant use, selection, and management, and sustainability. And one of the first main aims that we're aiming to address is how do human societies select certain plant species and certain organs for medicinal use. Now, the global motivation for this is driven by global medicine security, and especially the use of medicinal plants. We know that over 350,000 species have been classified by botanists, and over 30,000 of them have been identified as useful species. And over 80% of the world's population relies on ethnomedicine as a primary source of healthcare. And this is an industry that generates over $100 billion worldwide due to international trade. So developing a thorough understanding on how human societies successfully select certain species for medicinal use, as well as their successful management via adaptive resource management practices, is ultimately invaluable to human societies around the world. Now, what we know is that certain plant families are not equal in terms of their medicinal plants, and that certain plant families tend to have a greater proportion of medicinal plant species than others. However, little research to date has been focused on developing an in-depth mechanistic understanding on how certain societies select certain plant species or organs for medicinal use, as well as the evolutionary basis for medicinal plant selection and their conservation implications. So research in my lab will help to directly address some of these concerns by testing several theories and hypotheses in ethnobiology and conducting harvest impact assessments on culturally important plant species, focusing on the plant population dynamics of these species in response to harvests. Now, there are numerous theories in the discipline surrounding medicinal plant use and selection, and for those that want an in-depth understanding of them, along with a direct path forward on how to test them, I encourage you to review our 2017 and 2021 papers. The first major theory that we're aiming to test in my lab is the theory of non-random medicinal plant selection. And to place this into context historically, there's been a misconception that many human societies will select medicinal plant species at random via trial and error. However, we know that human societies have an extensive knowledge of their environment, and they use this knowledge to identify useful species for medicine. Therefore, the prediction of the non-random plant selection theory is that human societies will purposely select medicinal plant species based on plants that they consider having medicinal value. And the idea and work that pioneered this was originated from Dr. Dan Moorman at the University of Michigan in the early 1990s. And he actually contributed to the early theoretical development and thinking in this field. He was actually the first to demonstrate that plant families with a greater number of species within a given pharmacopoeia tend to be selected for and have a greater number of medicinal uses. So he was the first to show a positive relationship between the total number of species within a plant family and the number of medicinal plant species within that family. And he also showed that certain plant families can be over or underutilized, where overutilized species tend to have more medicinal plant species than you would predict given their size, and underutilized plant families tend to have less medicinal plant species than you would predict given their size. And what this suggests is that certain plant families may be preferentially selected for, not because they have a greater number of species, but because species within those families tend to have greater medicinal value. Now, many years later, with phylogenetic work in New Zealand, Nepal, and South Africa can actually confirm this idea, where certain plant clades tend to have more medicinal plants than others, demonstrating that the distribution of medicinal plant use is greater among certain plant families. And other work by colleagues in West Africa have also supported this idea, where they demonstrated that most medicinal plant species that are selected for use tend to be phylogenetically clustered, showing there's a strong phylogenetic signal for overutilized medicinal plants that tend to be among certain clades. And this work has been extended to include another major theory in ethnobiology, which is the theory of non-random organ selection. And this predicts that not only are medicinal plant species selected at non-random, but so too are their organs for medicinal use. And this makes sense because when people are selecting plants for medicinal purposes, they're actually targeting certain organs to produce a given treatment. And therefore, we can expect the nested selection of plant organ selection within plant families that are evolutionarily close. And preliminary support was demonstrated for this in West Africa. And when we combine these two theories and their major hypotheses, we would expect that plant families that are closely related evolutionarily are more likely to have similar medicinal uses than those that are distantly related, because species within those families often inherit defense characteristics that influence their usefulness and effectiveness as medicines. Therefore, certain plant families are expected to have a greater proportion of medicinal plant species that produce chemical compounds that are useful for medicines. And within these families, we would also expect human societies to primarily target organs that are rich in secondary chemistry, because this is what makes them useful for medicinal use. Therefore, certain species, organs such as young leaves, would most likely be preferentially selected for because they have greater composition of chemical compounds rather than old leaves, which tend to become rich in physical defenses over time. And as a result, we would predict that evolutionarily close species have similar organs selected for medicinal use, which is what has been shown here, and that plant organ selection tends to be phylogenetically clustered. So in other words, plants that are used medicinally that are closer related evolutionarily tend to have similar organs selected for medicinal use. Now there's another angle or domain, which brings us to the third major theory that we're aiming to test in my lab, which seeks to understand how and why certain organs are preferentially selected, like leaves, roots, and bark, over others for medicinal use, along with their fitness-related costs. And to understand these factors that drive preferential organ selection, we seek to test the optimal defense theory. And this has been borrowed from chemical ecology. Now, from an ecological perspective, it's expected that certain plant organs have richer secondary chemistry, and actually plants will maximize growth and defense by putting greater secondary chemistry in organs that have greater contribution to fitness. Now, when we apply this in ethnobiological context, the optimal defense theory predicts that humans will purposely and consistently select organs that have a greater contribution to plant fitness, which tend to be the greatest enriched in secondary chemistry. Now, while there's been preliminary support for the first two major theories, it's unclear whether there's both local and global support for the third, and therefore we're seeking to conduct the first global analysis on these major theories and their predictions. And really, findings from our work will identify hot nodes of plant lineages that are more likely selected for medicinal use, and within them, patterns of organ selection that drive preferential selection. And ultimately, results from our work will have practical applications for conservation biology, sustainability sciences, obviously global medicine security, since 80% of the world's population relies on plants for ethnomedicine. And then there's also potential for ethically driven medicine discovery within the context of avoiding viral piracy. And this is where the benefits to these discoveries can actually go back to directly increasing the livelihoods of the communities that are responsible for their knowledge and discovery of these medicines in ways in which these communities actually choose. And we've seen an incredible example for this, for example, in America Samoa, with Dr. Paul Allen Cox, who's a student of Richard Evans Schultes, who successfully negotiated rights and profit sharing from pharmaceutical companies for the botanical discovery of prostratin, which is a promising HIV treatment that came from the bark of a culturally important tree. So there's incredible implications globally for this research. Now, because medicinal plant use and harvest often preferentially targets certain organs that have a greater contribution to plant fitness, one of the major goals of research in our lab is to understand the demographic cost of harvest on the plant populations that are harvested for medicinal use. Therefore, we're using applied ecological methods, focusing on plant population dynamics and understanding adaptive ecosystem management practices by local people. And the ultimate goal here is for us to understand some of the fitness-related cost of harvest and to help guide and inform sustainable use strategies and management of these natural resources. Now, to give a prime example of a medicinal plant complex that has had major sustainability concerns recently, I'll be focusing your attention on ayahuasca. And those that are unfamiliar, ayahuasca is a psychoactive decoction or tea primarily used by the combination or primarily prepared by the combination of several source plants, one from the bark of this jungle liana, Banisteriopsis caapi, which is usually and most commonly combined with the leaves of this Psychotria viridis shrub in the coffee family, but it can also be combined with the leaves of another Malpighiaceae liana, Diblateris caberana. Now, since Banisteriopsis is the most commonly harvested source plant for ayahuasca brew, we're focusing on understanding the plant population dynamics in response to harvest and environmental variability over time. And we're seeking to understand these factors because over the last 3 decades, ayahuasca has become well known for its therapeutic potential. And as a result, it's being consumed by people all over the world beyond its ancestral home in the Amazon basin. And this is in part driven by considerable evidence to indicate that ayahuasca consumption can enhance creativity, reduce anxiety, exhibit antidepressant and anti-addictive effects, improve psychological well-being and quality of life, and facilitate the formation of new neurons in the brain. All of which points to the great therapeutic potential of ayahuasca in therapeutic context. But at the same time, ayahuasca use is deeply rooted in the social organization and worldviews of numerous Amazonian communities throughout the Amazon basin that use it for religious, spiritual, and ethnomedicinal purposes. So as a result of increased global sustainability concerns, we're using integral projection modeling in ethnobiological context to understand the demographic responses of harvest on ayahuasca liana vital rates in the Amazon basin. And this ultimately will allow us to understand some of the fitness-related cost of regular bark harvest. Now, from a botany perspective, ayahuasca is a jungle liana in the Malpighiaceae family that can reproduce sexually via Samoyed schizocarp samaras or clonally via new ramets following harvest or host tree falls because the liana uses trees to support it as it grows to the heavens. Now, in our first and only study on the population dynamics of Banisteriopsis in response to harvest, we demonstrate that sustainable harvest in wild populations is primarily driven by the survival of larger size class individuals within the population. Now, what this means is that sustainable harvest can be achieved when targeting certain life vital rate stages. And because these lianas experience regular bark harvest for medicinal use, we also found that there's reproductive strategy trade-offs in favor of clonal reproduction. And this is expected given that sexual reproduction often requires greater energetic investments, and increased investments in clonality are often a direct result of liana disturbance, which is what's been demonstrated by harvest. And our study demonstrated that although clonality can effectively mediate some of the effects of harvest, unfortunately, when harvest intensity is too great, it can actually overshadow the effects of clonality and drive high harvested populations to decline, which is what we've shown here. Now, recently, we've expanded the research on the demography of ayahuasca lianas to include several local taxonomic varieties in an agroforestry setting while working with Shipibo Canibo partners around the city of Santa Rosita, Peru, around the city of Pugalpa. And for the Shipibo, they're a panalinguistic family in the Amazon that primarily use ayahuasca in ethnomedicinal context to diagnose and treat various forms of illness. Now, to date, we're aware of 4 different ayahuasca liana varieties that the Shipibo use to prepare the medicine. However, it is unclear if they're taxonomically unique from Banisteriopsis caapi. Now, there's been numerous ethnotaxonomic varieties described based on various morphological features like swollen nodes, color of bark, or even color of the xylem and phloem and cross-section, as well as their applications in ethnomedicine. And while there's been some preliminary taxonomic work to help tease apart some of the botanical identity of several varieties by researchers in Brazil, more work needs to be done to provide unequivocal support for whether or not these are definitively unique taxa, as well as how many different varieties or even species are used by Amazonic communities throughout the Amazon basin. Therefore, as part of research in our lab, I'm hopeful to actually collaborate on a study comprehensively on the genomics, the taxonomy, and the secondary chemistry of the 4 varieties that we're currently growing. And we're growing them in part of our partnership with a Shipibo-led nonprofit organization, Pachinishi. And this ultimate goal of our project is to restore 20 hectares of degraded land in an agroforestry setting where we have over 500 companion trees that support the lianas that are currently planted, along with 250 lianas consisting of the 4 ayahuasca varieties planted across several environmental gradients. One in an area that experiences periodic flooding, and one area that experiences periodic drought. And ultimately, our goal is to understand their ecology, their population dynamics in response to harvest and environmental variability, and ultimately their taxonomic differences. And one of our primary goals is to increase ayahuasca liana abundance to well over 5,000 with their associated companion trees, while laying the foundation for a sustainable ayahuasca production in the area. And in doing so, we're also seeking to understand the differences in ayahuasca host tree specificity, because we know the lianas can tend to prefer certain host trees over others based on resource availability, light availability, and community tree composition. And finally, because I mentioned these lianas frequently experience bark harvest for medicinal use, which drives reproductive strategy trade-offs in favor of clonal reproduction, there's a question of whether or not there's reduced genetic diversity driven by harvest. And one of our goals is to understand if clonality can effectively mediate the effects of short and long-term harvest, and ultimately some of the biological consequences of potential reduced genetic liana diversity over time. So therefore, we're also investigating if there is some reproductive strategy trade-offs that would drive reduced ayahuasca liana diversity, genetic diversity, and some of the consequences of biological harvest. Now, another part of our work with Pachinishi in collaboration with our Shipibo partners is also to facilitate the co-creation of knowledge, to form the foundation for woven science frameworks. And this is a knowledge that combines contemporary ecology with local indigenous knowledge. And ultimately, our goal is to help inform sustainable ayahuasca production. Now, to put this into context, what we know throughout history is that human societies have cultivated a sophisticated relationship with their environment. And this relationship is built on collective understandings on how plant species are selected for specific uses, along with plant management strategies that serve as a foundation for an embodiment of knowledge that guides and informs sustainable use, adaptations to environmental changes, and management of natural resources that is passed down over generations. And this extensive ecological knowledge is invaluable to the sustainable management of these resources and the continuation of the beliefs and practice and knowledge associated with them. Therefore, we're fostering the integration of these knowledge systems to produce woven science frameworks through our projects that prioritize safeguarding these sacred medicines for future generations while fostering the continuation of local knowledge through education, cultural exchange, and economic opportunities. And the idea behind this is that by combining Shipibo cultural knowledge with the principles of modern ecology, we can co-produce actionable solutions surrounding sustainable ayahuasca production and ultimately provide it in such a way that it can inform the production that is locally grown and sustainably sourced medicine. An additional approach that I'm using to aid with the co-production of knowledge is actually by directly supporting local knowledge holders in my lab. Therefore, for example, I'm aiming to support Shipibo students. Liz here, who's pictured here, she's a prospective student in my lab. She's ultimately from a Shipibo community in San Francisco, Ucayali, Peru, where she spent much of her life living amongst the forested region of the Amazon basin. Therefore, she's embodied a unique and diverse way of relating to the natural world and ecosystem management on the natural resources in which her community relies on survival and their livelihoods and subsistence. She attended the Ucayali National University of Agricultural Sciences, where she earned her bachelor's degree in agroforestry. And in our lab, she'll play an essential role in helping to guide the Pachinichi project, seeking to cultivate a sustainable future in the Amazon basin. And the idea behind this is that by supporting local knowledge holders in the lab, students will become leaders in the field as well as empowered knowledge holders in their communities, and where they can carry with them an integrated understanding of restoration ecology rooted in the principles of modern ecology, but combined with the Shipibo cultural knowledge. And in this way, they can successfully play a role in guiding and helping to continue sustainable use strategies in the Amazon basin, while also supporting the continuation of sacred traditions. And lastly, since many traditional funding sources to support interdisciplinary sciences have shifted their availability, we're also embarking on a grassroots approach to support students in funding through my lab. This includes generous donations from supporters, nonprofit organizations, philanthropists, and more. So for anyone that's interested in joining our journey and supporting us in any way, I encourage you to reach out through my lab website or my email. We'll be continuing to document our journey and supporting the continuation of hypothesis-driven research in ethnobiology, and at the same time, contributing to our collective understanding on how we can work to achieve global medicine security and sustainable harvest of natural resources that are essential to communities around the world. And I'll leave you here. Thank you very much. We have a couple minutes for question, I imagine, if any.
Yeah.
Sir?
I have the question about how the non-random selection of plants, medicinal plants works. Like, does that start with people just happen to find a medicinal plant and then they'll look for plants with features that look like that, or how does that work?
So there's a lot of theories on the selection of medicinal plants. I mean, you're talking about potentially the doctrine of signatures, which is also a theory in ethnobiology. And, that's a good question. When I work with the Amazonian communities and I ask them, how did you discover these plants? They tell us, well, the plants told us. There's the concept that all plants have intelligence, they have spirit, and they have a way of communication with the local people. So there's a dynamic there when you try to understand the local perception of how they apply their knowledge to identify species. But from a scientific perspective, we're looking at plant families and the proportion of medicinal plants within those families, and ultimately the plants that are selected for use and being able to test it that way. So it's complex, whether we're looking at from an emic perspective or an etic perspective on how that is evaluated. But we have a great synthesis of the theories in the discipline in our 2017 paper that goes into detail on how these theories are, what the motivations are, how they're tested to date, and how one could actually take that up and test for themselves in different study systems as well. So I encourage you to review that as well, and we'd love to have more people that are, supporting this work. Ma'am.
How open are indigenous people in sharing all this knowledge?
That's a good question. I think it depends on the indigenous people you work with and their experience with previous researchers and so on and so forth. Nowadays with wisdom, I try to approach it as, how can I help you? With the position that I have and the abilities that I have coming from the lenses that I have, how can we help each other? And I try to approach it from an area of reciprocity and reverence. For example, I was talking to you, sir, earlier. I feel deeply indebted to the communities that I work with, because I earned my PhD because I was able to spend time with them, talk story with them, learn about their use of plants, sit in ceremonies with them, participate in their rituals, and gain an understanding for my own self, which will never be as in depth as what they know for themselves, right? But at the same time, I feel a deep gratitude and duty, an internal duty, to be able to support them in any way that I can through the work that I do. So when we talked about this project, and having the Shipibo actually lead it themselves, and for me to support them in the way that I can, this is, the culmination of that process of me trying to help them and to ensure that they can produce their medicine to take care of their communities and to have economic benefits from it as well. Because, whether we love it or not, ayahuasca tourism is always going to be, happening, at least in the current state that it is.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Yeah.
How are you dealing with expectations? I mean, is there kind of like, or expectations also in the form of like timeline? Is that an expectation that there will be results very quickly, or on either side? I mean, it's kind of like.
Well, I'm very honest, having, information and knowledge about restoration in general, which can take decades to achieve, right? And I think that's the important thing to bring into focus, is that, we'll do what we can with the resources that we can and provide such documentation and a path forward that others can pick up, where, the continuation is. And so that's just being honest about it. And the expectation is that we will do everything I can to achieve these goals, but we have no promises because there are so many different uncertainties. And, that's what I aim to, communicate at the most. Ma'am. Thank you.
I'm curious about the field of ethnobiology in general. My first part of my question is, does it generally trend toward focusing on plants? And then the second part of my question is, how do you think it relates to the fields of like socio-ecological systems research?
Beautiful question. Well, ethnobotany, which is the subdiscipline of ethnobiology, is the sole focus on plants, right? And ethnobiology also includes the use of animals and other organisms. So it's more broad than, the traditional definition and focus in science. Now, for your other question about social ecological dynamics, I personally am a little biased, but I'll say that we're in the perfect position to be able to study them, because we're combining the knowledge of ecology and even social science aspects of it. I think that's what's one of the beauty of the field in itself, is we have such a range of people with expertise in different backgrounds that have their skill sets. And that, my idea and hope for the discipline as it continues to evolve is that we continue to integrate our knowledge systems. And I think the integration of knowledge systems will lead to some of the greatest advancements in our understanding of human environmental relationships and how we can play a role in successfully guiding that in our way. Did that answer you? Okay. Sir.
Yeah, thank you very much, Michael. I want to learn a bit more about what the Shipibo community, what their perspectives are on, the benefits from reforesting through this effort.
Mm-hmm.
And then also like, are there other economic benefits tied to this production of ayahuasca and the medicine?
Well, beyond the ayahuasca production, we're also planting other non-timber forest products that are essential to the communities. So that'll also, like cacao, for example, is a primary, culturally important crop that produces income as well. So there will be economic benefits in that way to the community. For them, they're also really interested in having their own medicine and it to be locally grown and sustainably sourced, because they're well aware of some of the threats to the other ecosystems. I mean, I don't know, I can't recall if I mentioned this in the talk, but there were estimates that indicated that over 5.5 million servings were consumed by nearly 1 million people worldwide as of 2019. And the trend has only continued. There's over an estimated 200 retreat centers in the area where ayahuasca production has grown exponentially over the last several decades. And this is to provide enough brew for the people. Yeah, in the Ucayali and around the city of Iquitos, those are two main prime ayahuasca tourist cities. And this is to provide enough brew for just those areas, but then there's also the exportation of the concentrated brew to various ayahuasca communities and practitioners around the world. And we can only estimate how many tons of biomass are harvested from these source plants annually to meet exponentially growing supply and demand chains. So it's a very real concern. I mean, and to be honest, I want to be first and foremost, it's not that the harvest due to globalization is driving all these populations to decline. I mean, we have other threats to the ecosystem that support these source plants like deforestation, land use changes, mining, all of the external threats that threaten the ecosystems that support the plants. And so, harvesting can actually be done sustainably, especially when it's done intentionally and guided by local knowledge, which is what most practitioners would do among their communities. But because of this increased economic interest, we are now seeing local harvesters harvest beyond sustainable levels because they're trying to feed their families, they're trying to meet economic interest and so on and so forth. So I think helping to achieve locally sourced, sustainably grown medicine will be a great advancement locally in the area and maybe be a source and a foundation that can guide other projects where, there's plenty of ayahuasca in Brazil, Ecuador, other parts of the world. So if we can demonstrate how it can be done locally, maybe we can scale this up. And the intention is to scale this up in other areas. So if we can provide enough opportunity through sustainable production of ayahuasca and other non-timber forest products, then I think it'll be a success in that way.
And I would say, like, given like the exponential use and topic radio ayahuasca, what would you say is like the most, when you're trying to talk about concepts of conservation, which have maybe never been as much needed now as they were before because of the over-harvesting, and the very real need that these people need to be able to feed their families and stuff, what are some of your strategies for sort of getting forms of reforesting and stuff like that?
If I understand your question correctly, most people are well known or know well of the increased use and the globalization. I mean, this is what has given rise to tourism in the area. And, in a lot of cases, the local communities, some of them are very happy because they've benefited from this, economically. But there's also challenges in that because a lot of the people that own the retreat centers are not local indigenous people. And so the benefit is actually going to a lot of people outside of the traditional Amazonian communities. In addition, sometimes the local practitioners are hired to be a part of those communities, but they're not well compensated or they're working in different kind of conditions and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of complexity surrounding the area, but I'm hopeful and really hope to inspire an increased emphasis on locally grown, sustainably sourced medicine, because I feel like, and I'm hopefully not the only one, but the idea that if a given retreat center is growing enough medicine where they can actually produce enough that it lessens the threat or the overexploitation of wild harvested plants, then maybe there can be a balance there. But I don't have all the answers, but I'm hopeful to contribute to part of our understanding and how we can achieve that. Did that answer your question? Thank you.
Yeah, one more.
Sir.
You mentioned the 4 different varieties that are identified
Mhm.
by the community. Is there any work going on within botanical taxonomic circles to further investigate that? And how would you see best going about that?
You want to help? I would love a collaboration because I would love to work on the genomics, the taxonomy, the secondary chemistry too, because we found variation in the alkaloids produced versus, locally cultivated varieties versus wild varieties as well, and differences in secondary chemistry. So how that affects the medicine overall, it still remains to be seen. Locally, there has been talk about a preference of wild harvest because it has, certain qualities to it. But I would love to continue the work and collaborate and welcome collaborations from other, universities and people in the field. It would be awesome. So you're a taxonomist. Let's go.
Yeah, well, I mean, the sort of confirmation from our side.
Yes.
The validation of more diversity was already known in most of the communities.
Absolutely.
I mean, that's actually, yeah, something that has gained a lot of attention recently in a few specific publications. So
Absolutely.
I see it as an important part of validating the traditional knowledge.
Well, even beyond validation, their knowledge is invaluable. I mean, you think about it, we all come from some lineage or some culture somewhere. Even though we're living in, our advanced civilization, so to speak, our ancestors somewhere along the line had extensive knowledge of the environment. And this knowledge is invaluable. I mean, our society in which we live in now, whether we want to admit it or not, is very fragile. The institutions that we have developed, they're being challenged right now. The global stocks of resources have diminished significantly, and we're now in an era where we have some critical decisions to make. And one of the things that I'm hopeful for is, through the lenses of ethnobiology and other related disciplines, that we can further encourage a reappreciation of traditional knowledge systems, because these are the people that have safeguarded this knowledge that remain. Many cultures around the world knew and lived among nature, had a relationship in nature and a reverence for nature. And I think part of the beauty of technology and innovation, and we've allowed ourselves to have convenience and everything that comes with it. But at the same time, it's come at a cost of separating ourselves from traditional ways of being and being a part of nature. And if we, idealistically, I guess I would hope that we can teach from kindergarten all the way up, a direct connection, about how do we make food? How do we grow food? How do we create clothing? How can we sustainably manage the resources that we have and that still remain today? And I think traditional knowledge systems hold the clues. They hold that knowledge that allow us to be able to survive. I mean, if anything, happens to our supply chains, can any of us here go out and track an animal and hunt it? Can we make our own medicines? Can we produce enough food growing to feed our families? Sure enough, if it happened tomorrow, we'd all be in a frenzy trying to figure things out, and things would go sideways rather quickly. But then when you look at traditional knowledge systems and communities that are still living among nature, it's an everyday thing. They go get what they need. It's there. They do it in a way that has reverence. And potentially there's something to rediscovering that and appreciating what is still intact. and acknowledging that these are the traditional knowledge holders that keep that knowledge alive. And we should be honoring that and appreciating that in as much ways as possible, because our survival may actually depend on it. That's what I try to teach my students. And I hope they walk away with and in some way, embark in a dialogue with their families and their communities about, wow, what is it? What are these plants that my grandfather used or my grandmother knew about, that talked about? What are their stories, and what are the relationships to our family? Those are the things that, can really, I think, inspire change in people, recognizing that all of us have a connection to plants and nature, for all the resources that we consume daily, the oxygen we breathe, the clothes that we wear, the food that we consume, the food that we consume consumes, everything comes from nature. And we're so reliant on everything that it provides. And I think re-acknowledging that will help us have a reappreciation for what we have and ultimately what we've lost, and really inspire work to get back to restoring what we are missing out on. And like I said, I think the survival of our species depends on it.
In there. Good place.
Thank you.